Hello, and welcome to the seventh and final episode of our special AIES podcast series on US-Europe relations. For all our new listeners, this series focused on some of the major trends, developments, and challenges in the transatlantic relations, from the future of NATO to the fight against climate change, and featured high-level experts from the US sharing insightful perspectives from their side of the Atlantic. This podcast series was made possible in part through the generous contribution of the Austrian-American Partnership Fund. Today, we will talk about the West's preparedness for a possible next Great War, and I'm delighted to do that with Dakota Wood, Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Mr. Wood's research and writing focus on programs, capabilities, operational concepts, and strategies of the US Department of Defense and military services to assess their utility in ensuring the United States has the ability to protect and promote its critical national security interests. Mr. Wood serves as the editor for Heritage Index of US Military Strength. This is the only annual assessment available to the public of the status of America's military and its ability to carry out its core functions. Before joining the Heritage Foundation, Mr. Wood served in the US Marine Corps for 2 decades in different high-level positions, from where he retired as Lieutenant Colonel in 2005. Welcome, and it's a great pleasure to host you today.
I'm very excited to have this conversation. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I don't know how we cram everything we need to talk about into a short period of time, but very excited to look forward to the chat.
And we have a very challenging title for our final episode, which is the West Prepared for War? Now, in the presence of a global power, there is always kind of a process of polarization. This process of polarization leads to the creation or emergence of a secondary center of power, organized around a pole consisting of a single competitor or a group of competitors or rivals that seek to undermine the incumbent's global power supremacy. So to put things into perspective, a global reserve currency is not possible nowadays without the global power projection capabilities that enable the United States to control the interconnected flows of goods, capital, services, and data, and to protect trade and transport routes from disruptions that might result in major supply shocks or regional military conflicts. So my first question to you is, what is the current state of US military power? And does the United States still have global power projection capabilities?
So the second part to that, in terms of global power projection, absolutely. I mean, even in the crisis that currently exists in Afghanistan, we're seeing an example of the ability to take strategic airlifters, C-17 cargo aircraft, and deploy them hundreds, if not thousands of miles, pick up folks and equipment, and then bring them back. And on a daily basis, the U.S. military really does operate on a global footing. Just like commercial airliners, we've got aircraft moving all over the place. We have U.S. Navy ships plying the waters of many different distant seas and all. So yes, there is this physical ability to project power. And I think the United States continues to be fairly unique in its ability to conduct and to sustain military operations at great distances from the homeland. Most countries have a military force of some type, and they operate either within their own country or in very close proximity, right? Whereas the United States, surrounded by big oceans, if you're going to do anything other than the North American continent, you just have to go a very long distance. And it's due to foreign basing, alliances, and those sorts of things where we're able to do that, hence the importance of partners and allies. As far as the first part of the question, what is the status of America's military power. It's all relative, isn't it? I mean, you can have a whole bunch of very old equipment, but if the enemy that you're fighting is equally ill-equipped or doesn't have as much, then you can still win through blunt force and through attrition and just outlast your competitor. If the competitor you're going against is very modern, new equipment, well-trained, well, then it's a different sort of game. And so I think the U.S. military is kind of caught in a both situation. It has a lot of old equipment that was procured in the 1980s and 1990s. But over the years, it's continued to try to improve that. You can have an old airplane, but it has a new radar system or it has more advanced weapons. And so it extends the longevity of that particular platform, right? At some point, though, the platform itself, the ship or the tank or the airplane, just doesn't have as much viability. And so you need to retire it and bring new things in. At the same time, we also have brand new equipment. I mean, new munitions, new space-based capabilities, improved ability to share information, which would make perhaps an older equipped force more effective than would otherwise be the case. So as we try to convey in this index of U.S. military strength that you mentioned, the U.S. military is a case of both. It has a lot of old equipment in dire need of modernizing, being replaced with new sorts of things. And yet at the same time, it's very experienced. A lot of effort is put into training and readiness. It has a half a century or more of deploying outside of the United States and working with other militaries, which is a set of experiences that really no other country has, especially at that scale. So on a one-for-one, large combat sort of footing, we're still convinced that the U.S. military could win in that. The question then, which I think you'll probably get into, is can you do more than that? It's a big world, where the U.S. has interests that are challenged by Russia and China, which are, in very different geographic settings. There's a Middle Eastern issue with Iran. And so how much of the U.S. military can be deployed, and does it have the ability to conduct operations? And that's where we start to get into some serious questions.
Also, we have a very fresh example in Afghanistan, and we need to address this issue. Now, great powers have always tried and failed to turn Afghanistan into a hotbed for their geopolitical ambitions. America is the latest superpower to suffer kind of a catastrophic defeat, according to some experts in this country, following 2 decades of nation building and military occupation. In my view, Washington's poor performance in delivering specifically major energy infrastructure and connectivity projects has been one of the biggest failures over the past 20 years in this case. Now, meanwhile, Beijing is carefully preparing to fill the void left by the United States. Will Afghanistan change the balance of global power, in your view? And what role do the transatlantic allies and particularly Europe play in this case?
I don't think that China is going to be any more successful than the United States or Russia if we go back to the 1980s. Because the expectations are often divorced from the realities on the ground. So one aspect of this military involvement for 20 years on the part of the United States, I think, was a misread of what military power can actually accomplish. What is a tank or an airplane or a soldier? What can they actually do? Which is a different set of things than what economic initiatives do, or what diplomacy can do, or cultural exchanges, or the cultural basis for a people and how they relate to each other and to other peoples beyond their borders. So military power, my read of history and my own experience, is it can create a space within which other things occur, but it can't replicate or do those other things if the relevant institutions aren't effective on both sides of the discussion, right? So if the Afghan people or their power structures their own interest and abilities in doing their own security environment. And by that, I mean even local police. If the average Afghan citizen is routinely having to pay a bribe to the local police in order to go about their business, well, there's not a whole lot that the U.S. military can do to change that dynamic. And so where we saw missteps on the part of the United States over this 20-year period is going in with a military security purpose to get at Al-Qaeda, who had conducted the terror attacks way back in 2001. But then there was this vision of transforming Afghanistan into a pseudo-modern sort of society and country and its economic productivity. And it's just a much larger challenge. So the military component can help to create, again, a space within which these other activities occur. But if the culture and the country and its political processes aren't tuned and prepared to do that, then it becomes a problem. And so I think what had happened over the last, say, 4 years is an appreciation that the U.S. could sustain a military footprint in Afghanistan at very low levels to kind of go back to its security concerns, counterterrorism operations, keeping an eye on various terror groups and bad things that might occur in that region. And the region there's been this historic focus on Afghanistan, it's right there at the heart of Central Asia. And so in the modern context, you have Pakistan, you've got the Central Asian republics from the former Soviet Union, you have Iran, you can kind of keep a geostrategic eye on what's going on in China. And so, if you're not there in the region, then you're kind of guessing. But people had lost focus. So just as Russia tried to impose its will on Afghanistan, China now wants to take advantage of the economic opportunities and strategic minerals and those sorts of things. They will also be challenged because the local culture and the local tribal entities and power structures just don't want to be pushed around. And unless you're going to invest your entire military in this very landlocked, mountainous, rugged, austere environment, to create and sustain your own reality, I think it's just always going to be fraught with frustration and loss and a lot of expense that doesn't result in the things you're trying to get in the first place.
You also argue in one of your latest works that in an event of a major conflict, America would pretty much have to rely on its own military resources. And what it has to rely on is a shadow of what it had. Why are America and its allies not prepared for the next great war in your view, as you claim, or are they actually prepared for the next great war?
No, they're not prepared at all. We've had, since the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, we've had 30 years of relative peace and prosperity. Everybody's making money. The IT sector, information technology sector has just exploded. People have been able to do things without the worry of some kind of a global nuclear exchange, or massive warfare on the European continent between Warsaw Pact and NATO countries. And so that tended to focus people on these very big security, existential in the true sense of words, sorts of challenges or threats. Well, once the Soviet Union went away in the early 1990s, and then throughout that decade, there was no globally capable China. It just wasn't the economic powerhouse that it is today. You didn't have a nuclear North Korea. You didn't have an Iran that is near nuclear and trying very hard to get there, right? So it was just a different sort of world. And so that the compact, the agreement between governments and their people, leveraged that, took advantage of it, where you have subsidies from governments in many countries around the world, Europe in particular, let's say, in the United States. Who needs this massive military that was needed during the Cold War? And so even in the US during the 1990s, there were dramatic reductions in the capacity and the modernization of US forces, because it was just this fanciful notion that was easily dismissed. We'll never go to war with another great power. It's too destructive. Everybody is too economically interdependent. Why would a China, for example, try to take Taiwan by force if there were going to be economic repercussions from that, right? And so it's imprinting our values or our way of looking at risks and benefits on a competitor who may have a very different calculation as to what they want to do. And so over time, forces shrink in size and in numbers, they continue to age, and you just haven't had to deal with any consequences. So for the United States in particular, given what occurred on 9/11 and the US decision to go into Afghanistan, who were you fighting? The Taliban had no, or Al Qaeda had no Navy, no Air Force, no heavy armored, formations. When the U.S. administration at that time decided to go into Iraq in 2003, the Iraqi military had lots of equipment, but very poor leadership, no effective tactics, no cohesion. I mean, it just kind of collapsed in various ways. So the United States could conduct military operations unopposed from the point of debarkation or embarkation in the United States to go anywhere you wanted to in the world. And those supply lines, the logistical support measures were never challenged in any meaningful way. Complete control of the air, no credible anti-air threat. Our Navy capabilities were never challenged at sea. So it breeds this mindset that you can do anything you want anywhere in the world with relatively low losses in terms of killed and wounded, when we compare it to big wars in the past. And so it just shapes how people think about military power. And so we've tracked what's going on in Europe, for example. For Germany, I think it was 2 years ago, no deployable operational submarines. They were having to contract to civilian aviation companies so that the military helicopter pilots could get into a working helicopter in order to keep their flight hour certification up. The British Royal Navy is an absolute shadow of its former self. They could have something like 17 surface combatants. Its Royal Air Force is almost irrelevant. I mean, in terms of big war sorts of things. Spain doesn't spend anything on its military. It was a national event for the Italians to deploy a single battalion to Afghanistan, when they were involved. So when we look at the numbers of capabilities and the age of the equipment, readiness of forces, what they're actually able to do in a real world situation, it is nothing like what countries fielded back in the Cold War. And yet you look on the other side of that contest, and what has China been doing? I mean, China adds the equivalent of another country's Navy to its own Navy every year or two. I mean, think about that, right? Iran has the largest ballistic missile inventory in the entire Middle East, with long-range missiles that can reach the center of the European continent. I mean, why would Iran need a missile that can range that far, right? And so we see these developments with these hungry countries that are investing huge amounts of capital in their military capabilities, and we don't see anything that mirrors that on the Western side. And on the Western side, I would include Korea and Japan and other countries coming along that would be in that grouping. So when we think about big war, where people normally go is it's all going to be space-based, it's all going to be cyber and robots or artificial intelligence, and you never hear talk about armored formations or aircraft or navies sinking the ships of other navies. And so we've just lost that sense over 30 years of relative peace of what war actually means. And it'll break out. I mean, the history of the United States, the history of the world is you have big wars every couple of decades or so, and we're just not ready for that. Mentally, societally, culturally, politically, or in our defense investments.
You also outlined that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, among others, have invested heavily to modernize their forces and equip them with the most up-to-date technologies. And against this background, do you think that China and Russia could pose a multi-front challenge to the United States and NATO at some point?
China and Russia have historical enmities. I mean, they've historically been competitors. Russia's been concerned about Chinese movements economically into the Russian Far East. So these are not friends. But if you have a common competitor in the United States, for example, there will be alliances of convenience. And so, yes, I do think that one could leverage an opportunity where the other actor ties up the United States in some way. Or let's say if Russia decided to actually create kind of a land corridor through Belarus and Lithuania to connect itself to Kaliningrad, what would the European response to that be? We haven't seen any real response to Russia seizing Crimea. We haven't seen any real serious response to Russia moving into Ukraine. And so it catches these governments flat-footed. So if something serious along those lines, or more so, occurred in Europe, wouldn't that be a great strategic opportunity for China to decide to surround Taiwan? I don't know that you'd actually have to physically invade, although that's a possibility, or to create more islands in the South China Sea, or to seize disputed islands from Malaysia or the Philippines or Japan or what have you. And so if you're the United States, from a U.S. perspective, if you don't have as much military force capacity to deploy globally in more than one theater, it presents a real problem. And I think this is an exploitable shortfall or vulnerability that certainly the capitals in Moscow and Beijing are looking at. So the potential is there. We in this business will often talk about deterrence. Well, what does deterrence really mean? Isn't that in the mind of the country or the person you are trying to deter? That their calculation is that you have the ability to prevent them from achieving an objective, or that the pain or the cost is much greater than the benefit that they're trying to gain through this military action. So if they assess that you have fewer capabilities or a lack of political will or seriousness, then their calculations may lead them to conclude that this deterrent value is much reduced, thereby incentivizing predatory or aggressive sorts of actions. So whether China and Russia would actually collaborate in an active way or achieve the same effect, just opportunistically, I don't know that it really matters. The point is what physical military capabilities do NATO member countries possess? Are they willing to use those, at risk, right, of loss or conflict? What does the U.S. What can the U.S. count on, or does it have to go it alone? Right. So even in Afghanistan, which is this great reference point, many countries contributed forces, but the forces contributed were often bound by rules of engagement or restrictions about what those forces could actually do in country. They couldn't leave the base, or they weren't able to operate at night, or they could do kind of a humanitarian or training sort of thing, but they couldn't, participate in combat action. Perhaps the forces couldn't even get to Afghanistan, and so the U.S. then would provide that strategic airlift, and then a lot of supply support, the logistical support to keep them in place. So there is some contribution politically or diplomatically, but it also incurs a cost or a burden in supporting that. I mean, it's just the reality of what occurs in these various theaters. And if you remember, not too many years ago, France led this effort to depose the Gaddafi regime in Libya. And it very quickly became apparent that absent U.S. support for airborne command and control, aerial refueling, and precision munitions, that military effort wouldn't have lasted more than 4 or 5 days. So we have these punctuations in the real world that really reveal some of the realities of military power. And the analyst then would look at that and try to ascertain how might Moscow or Beijing be looking at those things. And have we created an incentivizing, exploitable sort of set of conditions that are not in the long-term interests of the West?
The global system also reveals an emerging network of regional actors with limited power projections. You already pointed this out. And these middle powers or regional actors with limited power projection capabilities seek to navigate the systemic rivalry between Washington and Beijing. Among the main protagonists are countries such as Russia, India, Japan, Canada, key European states, Australia, and a few other relevant regional powers. Following COVID-19, they have one thing in common: to play a kind of a balancing act between the United States and China without getting caught by the difficult choice of taking sides. Are, in your view, new military alliances and defense partnerships emerging, for instance, in the Indo-Pacific region or in other regions following the global power shift? Or are we going back to the classic, to the traditional alliances and defense partnerships?
Well, I think countries react to stimuli, right? So if, for instance, in the Indo-Pacific, if China were not as large an actor with this very expansive navy, I mean, you know, the production or the shipbuilding leading to the growth of the Chinese Navy over the last 10 years has been dramatic. The recent revelation of their new ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile fields, 3 of them now, over 300, I think, silos that are being constructed. If you put a nuclear tipped missile in there that can carry up to 10 warheads, you're talking about a jump from just a few hundred warheads to nearly 4,000. I mean, it is amazing the building spree that China is on to improve its power projection sorts of capabilities. So I bring that up because prior to this, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Australia, other countries, the Philippines, other countries in that region wouldn't have had to have been as concerned. And so their alliance structure or lack thereof, you know, their tendency to kind of go things unilaterally or independently, you could continue that and just content yourself with economic trade and you know, how many container ships were you building, and you know, who was the central supplier of electronics and those sorts of things. But with China, very much more expansionist and more aggressive in sending its fishing fleets into the fishing waters of other countries, their exclusive economic zones, their maritime militia, Chinese Coast Guard, you know, with bumping incidents against Vietnamese fishing vessels, you know, those sorts of activities, creating a physical presence on islands that are claimed by other countries. Those countries now have to respond to that provocative behavior. And so we find today that diplomatic or diplomacy is different, political decisions are different, the willingness of various countries to kind of work together and sharing information and military exercises is different today than it was, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago because of this stimuli. You know, if Russia wasn't as aggressive in sending its airplanes in the airspace of Norway and, you know, Sweden, or really militarizing the Arctic North, would we see as much attention by Northern European countries in the activities of Russia? So it's a very dynamic environment, and national policies will adapt or change based on how that environment is changing. So I think that there are new arrangements possible today that weren't possible 10 years ago. And this is spurred by the activities of these big countries, you know, Russia and China in particular. Or what might Israel's policy be? Look at the Abraham Accord, where other countries in the Middle East now have formal diplomatic relationships with Israel, not because somebody thought that that was just a great idea, you know, absent any external influences, but because of the militarization of Iran and the development of its ballistic missile capabilities, its support to Hezbollah and Hamas and other groups, its involvement in Yemen. So again, this dynamic environment and a recalculation of security threats or security challenges that threaten the economic viability or the sovereignty of these various countries cause people in leadership positions to do things that they would not have done before that event occurred.
A final question is related to the future. Given the Biden's administration's priorities in the field of security and defense policy. What are the prospects for the transatlantic cooperation, and what, in your view, would be Europe's role?
I think people have been surprised that raw military power and naked aggression are still a feature of humanity. That on the liberal side of the political spectrum, I'm not talking party or anything, I'm just talking political philosophy and all, you would prefer diplomatic outreach, political discussions, cultural exchanges, economic activity. And somehow or other, there's this thought that we have gotten past 20th century or 19th century or 15th century, saber rattling and just, the use of military power. And what we see is that's just not the case. That the security element, the military element is still very much in play. Witness again, Afghanistan, where you had the Taliban with AK-47, military rifles and the ability to make roadside bombs. And yet, because they had the willingness to last and to continue this and to exploit aspects of, corruption and these other sorts of things that we kind of talked about earlier, they've defeated, in this sense that we're seeing unfold now, a very large modern power in the United States with satellites and missiles and bombers and ballistic missile submarines and all these other, trappings of a great power, right? So this aspect of military stuff and the use of force to impose your will on somebody else is still a reality in today's world, as advanced as everybody is, and as much as we might want to go to an enlightened state of philosophical truths and realities. So the role of Europe is to reassess its economic and energy dependencies on countries like China and Russia. I believe China is the largest trading partner for Germany, and I think it's the largest trading partner for the European Union. So if China is doing something in a negative sense, right, how willing are governments in Europe to threaten the economic relationship where you've got factory workers and making cars and all these other sorts of things that you want to sell to the Chinese, 1 billion person market? Using Germany again as an example, if there was a national decision not to go down a nuclear power route and increase your dependency on natural gas, for example, and then Russia comes calling and says, "Oh, hey, we'll build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline or whatever to provide energy to your sector." Well, you've decided to choose a path where you will then be dependent on your energy needs on a country that probably does not have your long-term interests in heart, right? So I know that this is a very controversial topic. It's been up for debate, but these are just examples of countries allowing themselves to get into a situation where they become dependent on other countries that really have an adversarial view of things, whether it's rule of law or World Trade Organization sorts of structures or currency manipulation. I mean, anything you want to talk about. And we've got the same, issue here in the United States. Very capable military, but it's 2/3 the size, in some cases 1/2 the size that it was 30 years ago. And you might have a very capable ship or airplane, but it can only be on one place on the planet at any given time. And if you lose it and you only had 10 ships and you lose one, that's 10% of your force. I mean, so there's a numbers game involved here that parlays into your ability to present a credible challenge that has deterrent value and that causes a competitor nation to think twice about doing something that might cause, some kind of a friction or a conflict. So I think where we at now in capitals is reluctance to admit realities, because if you admit that there is a problem, as we have been discussing, then it is incumbent upon you to try to solve that problem. And solving, for example, a military problem that has evolved over 30 years takes a lot of national treasure, and it takes a dramatic change in policies, and it causes a lot of angst in the relationship between government and population, where, how does that affect taxes? How does that affect government subsidies and quality of life and the risk of potential conflict? And people don't like to address those sorts of realities because of what it calls upon them to do. So I just think the reality of world history and the nature of people and competition among countries is kind of coming back with a vengeance, to remind governments around the world, but we're in particular talking about here in the West, that history isn't done with us, and that we have made some poor choices collectively over the last few decades, and the consequences of that will be very costly, both in people and in money.
So this was the final episode of our special AIES podcast series on US-Europe relations. And my guest today was Dakota Wood, Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your excellent insights and for your contribution.
I really appreciated the opportunity. I wish we were ending on a more optimistic note, but perhaps if there is a positive takeaway, it's just a reminder for people, and for governments, that if you're serious about your own future and you want to provide, bright opportunities for our children and those sorts of things, you just have to be realistic in embracing the world around you. So hopefully this is an entire learning experience for us, at national levels. And I'm just so glad we had this opportunity to chat about it. And again, thank you for having me on.
And for our listeners, feel free to check out the Index of U.S. Military Strength 2020. This was the latest publication, and I suppose this year the new publication is coming out.
It is. So we'll release on October 20th. It'll be the 2022 index, but we're reviewing the year 2021. So October 20th, heritage.org/military.
Perfect. Thank you very much.